So then in talking about the industry at large and some of those like positive contributions that might not be acknowledged, another one would be the investment that agencies make when they expand or redevelop or enter our county, right? Like, again, talking about the county commissioners and the city councilmen and the mayor sort of like trying to reindustrialize Portsmouth in a way that's like, if we would just get the factories back or the steel mill back, like everything would be okay. Those ships have sailed.
Right.
And I think it's like important to look at how do we come back from that and continue to keep what we have here nice. And I think behavioral health agencies play a huge part in that sort of like structural change. Talk about your perspective on that.
I think that piece in itself, and having all of these agencies as a whole locally understand their role within this community. And, I see everyone working really hard and doing a great job of trying to like combat a lot of those stigmas and just understand like the needs of the population and the people here that often go unseen because there is this kind of veil that people like to keep, and that's fine. But it's also really difficult when the majority of the community is greatly impacted by that. So
absolutely,
it becomes this really strange scale in some ways, because it's completely toppled to here's this community, and if someone isn't in recovery or in active addiction, they're absolutely impacted by this. And then on the other side, there is, just it feels like a handful of people, or a small number of people that are very resistant to that. And because it's like this holding on to what used to be, or like what was. And
I call it preserving decay.
Yes.
That the city of Portsmouth's population peaked within the late 1920s at 50,000. Since then, we've seen a vast exit from the city of Portsmouth. That we're hovering around that 20,000 mark at this point. We've seen the county population kind of be stable, but there's just not a lot going on in the city, and we've sort of for the last, and we're talking at this point almost 100 years ago, and that then we've seen from there the steel mills leave. We've seen the shoelace factory close. We've seen jobs go overseas. That's not unique to Portsmouth. That's an American problem, right? Like that's something that we've seen in the country, right? But it's like the individuals and the families who were able to prosper back in different times don't want things to change in any regard.
Right.
So then they have worked very hard to preserve the environment that has been ruining the city for maybe the last 100 years, right? So that's what I always say. My joke is I've never seen people work so hard to preserve something that was, like, don't touch it. It might not fall if you do something.
Well, and we can kind of rope in that piece for Appalachia as well, because that makes a lot of sense. And I can acknowledge like almost the grieving process in that for people within Appalachia that had kind of like these safety nets that are no longer there, and it is a really big loss. And having these factories that are no longer in place, like that was a safety net, and Appalachia is so ignored in so many ways, and and we feel that, but I think it's also important to acknowledge like people that might be resistant to this shift are also kind of almost like grieving that what used to be, and not quite knowing what that new Portsmouth looks like, or that new community piece. So I think that's a lot of the battle in itself.
It's so interesting to hear you say that too. Like, what will the new Portsmouth look like? It's like, I don't know if that's, until recently, I don't know if that's ever been considered that there would ever be a new Portsmouth. It's like Portsmouth was this, now it's this, and that's how it'll be forever. So that's like an interesting idea that even like people are starting to have the conversations of what will the new Portsmouth look like? What will be the next thing? What will be, how will we hang on or come back from this or whatever? Yeah.
And I think as with any change, we see resistance.
Sure.
And we see people kind of holding their own. And that's fine, and that's to be expected in a lot of ways. So I think it's just a matter of meeting the community where they're at as well, but also just embracing that piece for the recovery community, and just allowing them to have a spot. Because a lot of times it feels as though, we can acknowledge this. There's a lot of treatment centers here. There's a lot of people in recovery, but they don't really have their seat at the table. And I feel that that's a problem.
And it's like like you said, it's upside down. We're upside down in that we are a community vastly affected by this problem, and then a community that staunchly holds some ideas that we don't want to do anything about it.
Right.
Where it's like an upside down kind of deal, that the way that we look at how do we address the problem? It's like, as behavioral health agencies, as behavioral health professionals, we have ideas of the way that we address this thing, right? But everybody's like, well, we do something, but not like that, or not that, or
Right. And I think just anyone that works directly with, people in recovery, people, in harm reduction, at any step of this disease, I think we all just need to be very vocal. And I think right now is kind of a shift where, even though we're all tired, and it's constant, we need to just make some room for that and allow for people to have a seat at the table, and to get that started for them, and understand that that's just as important as all these other things.
Yeah, we got to go out and cause a ruckus. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
The whole behavioral health, counselor, social work world, very punk rock, right? We're gonna go out, cause a ruckus, challenge some things, maybe have some tough conversations people don't want to hear. Talking about your the other part that stuck out to me with the problem being so bad, and then the palette for the solution being so low. Again, curse of the region, right? Historically, Appalachians being a vulnerable population, historically impoverished, high rates of poverty, crime, low education, early birth, those kind of things, right? But then also too, it's tack on being targeted by Purdue Pharma and other industries. So I was looking through some data recently to do a presentation at Shawnee State, and it was the National Institution of Health. They have, decades at this point worth of data about the opioid epidemic and overdose crisis and those kind of things. And you see some changes in the national map, that, some states get worse and then maybe get better, or there's some changes in where things are going on at that point in time. The one thing that never changes is the Appalachian region is always at the top of the severity scale.
Yeah. And I don't know if that's just what the nation is used to, because it's always been that way, but or I think it's just a mix of it being so severe, and past a point where, like we were talking about earlier, just bringing our head up above water for a second, because we weren't able to have kind of the foreshadowing of that the rest of the nation had, because it started here. So
the cradle of the opioid epidemic was a phrase that I have tried to coin. I'm hoping somebody quotes me on it. That way it can be can be my thing. You know what I mean? That'll be my thing. It's Max Liles said it was the cradle of the opioid epidemic, but it is. It's we saw the infancy of that happen here, right? Yeah. I think another thing with the Appalachian region is that we will see a problem, we will know it needs addressed, and that we will hold our breath and cross our fingers from somebody to come and help us out and save us. And then if somebody does show up, we are very weary that person has good intentions to begin with.
Right.
It's our curse, right?
You
we
don't
know
belong here.
You're not. You even go here.
Yeah.
You're not from here. So it's one of those paradoxes for us, right? Is that we know something needs done, and we wish someone would come help, but it's the same thing within the treatment community. Well, what should quality treatment look like? Well, it should look like this, and it should do that over there.
Right.
But it's that same thing with the outsider that wants to come in. It's well, I don't know now that you're here,
Yeah, and it's just if we look at that from a mental health standpoint, and it's just trauma, like compounded
Layered
upon
on
trauma.
layered
And it's
and
like
layered.
one of those things that, the pharmaceutical companies came in and completely took advantage of an entire population.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not just a population that was, suffering, but had suffered for a long time. And
Historically, yeah.
so, it's a lot of these big pharma and like corporations just being predatorial and of course, we're not going to trust people coming in. And, I think that's just ingrained in us anyway, but
it's definitely a cultural characteristic for sure. Yeah.
But it's even more of like a recent trauma that surrounds all these things that we actually need help for.
Yeah. Well, and it's like you say, it's compounded. So the historically being taken advantage of, and then also recently being taken advantage of, just reconfirms that that's no good kind of thing. We had mentioned some of those things that that people in the community have access to, fire safety code, landlord laws, the ability to complain to, the local Adams Board or OMOS or Medicaid and those kind of things. Rather than addressing any of the treatment quality standard things through zoning, we've been putting a lot of content out recently about some things that people should consider when they're looking at like what a good provider is. Mm-hmm. What are some of the things that you have in mind when you're like looking for if a provider is reputable or not?
I think for me, I feel comfortable with someone going to a place that's just established. I don't care if it's nonprofit, for-profit, as long as they're established and, that's an understanding that, they have people in place that are licensed, and it's not someone just kind of like swooping in and having a sudden peak of interest within, giving people a place to seek help. So those are some, things to watch out for. And no matter what, I think people, no matter where they get treatment, those things are necessary. And having access to MAT, having access to methadone, having access to harm reduction, like whatever that pathway is.
Sure.
There's something out there for everyone, but the access is also very different.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think every agency, no matter how reputable they are, like overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And so they are meeting some of that sense of urgency, but over time, and I know that from personal experience and working in a place where, they had just completely shut them down, and a lot of clients were displaced as a result. And so that's kind of
displaced as a result of agency negligence at like a high level, right?
Yeah. So I think that's usually my fear. Is
that was a lot of people.
Absolutely. And we lost people because of that. So having someone that's established and good references, like if someone that goes there and they're really getting the care that they need, for me that's what matters.
Well, and you had brought up some really good points, dude. The level of education and license of a place and what sort of supervision that they're under. I know one of the anomalies that we saw that happened during COVID was like the way that clinical supervision could take place. There are agencies that exist that the clinical supervisor is never physically on site at the place. And it's just like, I understand that, certain things are happening in the world that maybe that there had to be some leeway involved in that. But it's nice to know, like, at the counseling center, like if I need to talk to my boss, I know that he will be here 40 hours a week, like physically to go have a conversation, or being able to have that kind of support. And I think that's like, you're educated, you're licensed people, and their availability is one of those things, a good question to ask for some of these like medically assisted interventions that happens. Like how often do I get to talk to like the doctor or the medical provider, right?
Yeah, and that's a really big one, and and again, there are some people that they are only ready for like medication assisted treatment, and that is A-okay. But, I think that also shows or exhibits like some of the quality of care that a place would provide if you don't really see a provider that often, or if it's kind of like spotty, that kind of thing. I think the most important thing is just getting what you need and finding it, and like there not being any stigma within that.
And I think that you bring up a good point too, is like getting what you need, whatever you're ready for at that point in time, whether it be a more harm reduction approach, whether it be a more, like abstinence-based approach, whether it be some sort of combination of various recovery pathways or whatever it might be. The good news is like there are good, reputable providers that do a wide variety of things, right? Like you don't have to compromise quality in order to get what you need, I guess is the point I'm trying to make. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Another thing that I know that I'm big on personally is like, what are the, a person can establish a facility, get an OMOS certification, have a Medicaid contract, and kind of start to provide services from there. So then looking past just the OMOS certification, CARF accreditation, and then JCO, medical and rehabilitation kind of standards that are nationally and internationally recognized. What do those mean anything? Are they important? Should agencies be pursuing them? What's your perspective on that?
My take is that if someone has opened up a place or a center because they see the need for that, I can appreciate their passion for that, for wherever that comes from. Not so much if it's like from a more profitable standpoint, but if they end up wanting to continue that and doing that in a safe way for clients, establishing, making moves toward like getting CARF accredited, or, just being established and getting established.
Yeah, that's when you say established, that's what I think of, like my credentials past what the baseline is. Like what's, it's the same thing with the licensure. If I go to a place and I see a counselor's assistant and then my group's by counselor's assistant, and I don't know who the counselor's assistant's getting supervised by. It's the same thing with the agency. If I have the baseline state level certification, that's good and we can get started.
Right.
But then what's on top of that, and on top of that for like consistency, quality, those kinds of things.
And just knowing the plan, and having a plan moving forward rather than, maybe having that grow and expand out and it being more focused on the profit piece of that. Having those, accreditations, that also helps us as a whole when it comes to like these politically motivated ideas to, to control what that looks like.
Gets our street cred up.
Exactly.
Makes us legitimate, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the thing, like behavioral health redesign in Ohio lumped, drug and alcohol treatment, substance use disorder treatment, mental health treatment, it lumped it back into healthcare. So like we are considered specialty healthcare. Right. I think a lot of times we're still seen as like witchcraft, voodoo, soft science, which we're into all that too. Okay. You know what I mean? Which we're into all that too. But there's also like we have a legitimacy to what we do. And so I think an agency should be interested in how are we seen from a legitimacy standpoint? And I think those accreditations are feathers in the cap that help prove that for the field at large.
Yeah. So again, like I commend anyone that wants to do those things and, has that passion. And, it's just a matter of continuing that and, getting together as a community with other agencies. And, we have to be unified in a lot of ways. So, especially when things like this pop up or, even if it's not really a serious proposition, when some of those conversations start happening politically, we have to kind of come together and have a baseline for that.
Yeah, and as a field too, if more agencies push themselves past that entry level standard, then that gives us a louder voice at those options, or those points in times too. You brought up the P word, profit, right? That's another hot topic, right? Counseling Center talks a lot about its nonprofit status, honestly. And if you look at our growth of the agency, the way that it's moved, the only way we've been able to do that is through our nonprofit status. But then also too, that's not to say that like, if you operate a for-profit entity, that that it is a bad thing, that it's some sort of voodoo as well. It more goes back to what all is it that you offer?
Right.
Is it even feasible for you to get a nonprofit status? Because not everybody gets one.
Yeah.
You know, everyone can't apply. They don't just hand them out. You know, you have to demonstrate things. What are some of the things you look for within the sort of, well, I guess outside of profit status, as far as like what determines a good agency in regard to that?
I think the retention of providers, I think across the board, like, and I know it's not just the state of Ohio, but we are just severely lacking people that are licensed, and and it really becomes an issue. So, you know, even if there are, you know, like CDCAs there, and you know, it's primarily that, like, I get it, you know, because it's so severely lacking.
Right. There aren't enough people to do the amount of work that needs done.
Right. But, you know, a lot of it comes from, you know, clients and people that are participating in those programs as well. I think that, you know, when we start hearing a lot of that and, you know, seeing that this is a pattern or a concern, then, you know, that's just one of those things that, you know, maybe not go there, or you know, like, some people are going to have their needs met at those places, and again, that's okay. But I think aside from that nonprofit status, retention of providers, their knowledge and education about that, and like where they're willing to meet the client as well. I think those are really big things.
I rather than, you know, and the profit status is one that we talk about, but it's one in a list of things. And so really the other side of that is, rather than just the profit status, while that's important, it's really probably more important to look at, I think that retention of providers is an awesome thing. Like, I hadn't thought about that. But then also too, is it possible to go to an agency and get what you need and be able to stay at that agency as what you need changes throughout the process, right? Because I think that's another thing that we see, and it's largely in the for-profit world, is that there are like single level of care or like single intervention programs. And it's just, I think from a client retention standpoint, probably better that we know every time we hand a person off that the likelihood of losing them it goes up. So if a person can go to an agency and receive start to finish care, I believe that you'll have like more quality outcomes. So that's sort of like what services are offered in the continuum being a huge consideration.
Right. Absolutely.
Then another one is like the locality of board membership, ownership, and then how they're affiliated with local stakeholders like the Adams Board. Right. There's a large number of agencies within kind of our 3-county region, and there's a handful that are even registered or affiliated with the Adams Board.
And I mean, I think that's a crucial piece, and, you know, having that as a foundation and a connection, just to understand what's going on, and to understand, you know, the access and just being up to date in general. You're kind of removing yourself from really big puzzle pieces when you're not a part of that. So awesome, man. Any closing thoughts for the listeners on all the stuff we've talked about? Dude, we've been from transportation, post-internship, to Medicaid expansion, the Affordable Health Care Act, behavioral health redesign, political climate, zoning. We need zoning czar Aaron Wagner here with us. I know he's big in the regional world on Portsmouth being rezoned. But what are, kind of like, to wrap it up, what are some thoughts you've got, or some final points to make? I think my driving point that I'm going to make is just with that integration piece, and you know, building a sense of community and not being afraid of it. You know, I think that we've seen some really beautiful outcomes recently, like with the Portsmouth Little Theater, and you know, we have an ongoing relationship with the Happy Pod and all kinds of other really great you know, businesses and organizations here, and that's what it's about. And I think just continuing to integrate that. And so if you are a business locally, if you want to work with the recovery community and break down some of those stigmas, like, just get a hold of us, because we would love that.
And to you know, like, reiterate that, if you are a community member generally and interested in spending time with the recovery population, like we know some people.
Yeah, right.
We can get you hooked up, man. So yeah, so good, dude. I feel like we've had such a good conversation.
Yeah.
Keep up with all the stuff that we've got going on social media, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Also check out our website. And again, if you've got questions or want to get involved, feel free to reach out to the agency in some regard. Whitney, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Closing the pilot episode. See you guys.